Hey guys, Montel here, and welcome back to another episode of Let's Be Blunt with Montel. Of course, I'm your host, Montel Williams, and today we've got a fascinating discussion lined up for you. We're going to talk about the future of cannabis at both the state and federal levels, and why legalization is pivotal and should be a pivotal issue in this upcoming presidential election. Joining us is a guest who knows a thing or two about the cannabis industry, Mr. Jason Vedadi, who is the CEO of Story Cannabis and a pioneer in the field, with a background in real estate development and finance. Jason co-founded Harvest Health and Recreation, taking the company public back in 2018 and steering it through a successful merger with Trulieve in 2021. Jason, thank you so much and welcome to the show. Welcome to Let's Be Blunt, sir.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Absolutely. So good to have you, especially on this topic. And let's just jump right in. First off, let's talk a little bit about your background and how you got into the cannabis industry, and then what led you to co-found Harvest Health?
Yeah, I've been in the industry on and off since 2009. It actually went legal in Washington State, which is my home state, and I started cultivating on my own. I found a love for it, and then one place led to the other. I went to college in Montana, that went legal. Then moved to Arizona, that went legal. Eventually built my own company, actually, before Harvest, called Modern Flower, which then merged with Harvest. And then I took that public in 2018. And then that company sold in 2021 to Trulieve. But, it's interesting. I had to give up a fairly, scaled development construction business for it. I grew a passion for it. It felt like pioneering, kind of the new front. It hasn't turned out exactly like I think anybody thought it would. It's fascinating when we deal with all the differences between state and federal legislation. And I was much more optimistic about where we would be today.
Yeah, I will bet you. I bet looking back, 2009, I can remember, I kind of started in this business back in really 2001 and thought because of the rapidity of 2001 to 2009 with the number of states that came aboard, this is going to continue to move this way. Then all of a sudden, screeching brakes and pushback from every direction that you could think of. My perspective on that was a lot of that pushback was due to us, this industry itself. However, would you have thought it would taken us as long as it has to get to here? And then didn't it surprise you that we have not gotten that much further than we are today?
At the state level, I think if you just said, 2008, 6, right in there, California, Washington, West Coast decide to kind of start implementing this state strategy and ignoring federal law. Where the states are today, I think is kind of played out how I would have estimated, the South coming in last and one state bouncing around, some being more political than others. On the federal level, I think in 18, when John Boehner took the board role at Acreage Holdings, I think that created a lot more optimism about where we were headed. But now looking back, I've got a lot more experience at the federal level. Looking backwards, I'm not surprised. So Monday morning quarterbacking that. Sure. But looking forward from then, I'd be shocked that we don't have at least banking or credit cards or some normalized process with the financial institutions. I would have thought we had uplisting by now. And now I'm kind of looking at it going, man, is it got a 2030 in front of it, before we see full-blown legalization? It feels that way.
It feels that way to me, my friend. I've been having discussions with lots of people from around the country and almost every level of this industry. And I got to tell you, I'm not as optimistic as I was. And I'm also a little bit, have a little trepidation about some of the states that are trying to roll back, even though they have been successful. So, I think one of the things that's so weird about it is that everybody's waiting for the sky to fall. Sky didn't fall. But now they're trying to see if they can pull a cloud or two down. It throws me a little bit, the reaction at the Fed level, but in some of the states around the country, you look at what Georgia did. Georgia passed a law that they did that is really as archaic as it could possibly be. No flower, no smoking, no vaping, and now, you got to go through a board to get every single product individually, approved. And, they're taking 5 to 6 months. And we've been fortunate. I've been working in Georgia with a different company than the one that you've been working with, but they've been having some issues down there just getting, every single individual SKU of every single product has to be approved by a group of people who had nothing to do with cannabis to begin with. It just blows my mind that this is where we are here in, 2024 almost. Yeah.
I understand the frustration there, but I think when there has been no law passed in one of these states to get anything passed, kind of starts the stepping stone. I
Sure.
mean, we've seen that lineage from a very restricted CBD, low THC market to eventually, rec. Florida's kind of on the cusp of starting from a very, very 5 license structured environment to now 50 licenses and kind of unlimited retail, and the businesses have kind of thrived. So it's like we almost have to take what we can get in this industry and then work with the legislators on an ongoing basis. And Georgia, just kind of at the inception of a very restrictive environment. I mean, New York was that way, and you wouldn't think that would be that way, right?
Right, right. And I think New York is going to be mired in all kinds of muck for quite a long time to come, just because they've not, I mean, in every single one of these situations, the black market, gray market is outperforming the legal market by 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to 1.
Yeah, the tax structure when you have regulated legal cannabis, right? It costs you more because you have all these testing requirements. You've got employees, you've got, unemployment tax, you're paying on the gross basically, right? And so like then black market paying no tax. So it doesn't surprise me that people are like, well, I can't believe people don't want to come in and buy your tested product. I'm like, a lot of these people have been buying from a street dealer for 40 years. I'm like, they're pretty comfortable. Like they're not sick. They're not dying. They haven't gone to the hospital. I'm like, yeah, can you really blame them? They're paying half and they're comfortable with it.
Correct. Well, let's just jump right on into this thing. Let's talk a little bit about this upcoming presidential election. Most people might not realize how crucial a candidate's stance on cannabis can be. And can you elaborate a little bit on this and talk a little bit about its importance? I mean, we do know that former President Trump, has stepped forward and said he's going to vote for the recreational initiative or adult use initiative here in Florida. I think some of that was done more to thumb his nose up at Governor DeSantis. However, him stepping out on the topic that should have been a topic that Harris had stepped out on earlier, but refuses to emphasize her stepping out on. But then I guess now recently, I don't know if you've seen, on TikTok and a couple of other places, there's a couple of interviews where she's talking about how this should just be something that should be legalized. And she hasn't explained exactly what she means by that term, legalization. But don't you think that this is something that both candidates should be weighing in on a little bit more heavily, especially right now as we're getting down to short strokes?
Yeah, I recently did an op-ed on this, and undecided voters in swing states heavily favor legalizing cannabis. And on the medical side, it's profound how positive it is. I don't think Americans agree on anything like they actually agree on legalizing cannabis now today, and having people get like the imprisonment side of it. I think everybody's like past the point where people should be like imprisoned over this drug, but it's a pretty interesting dynamic. It's almost like I sense the candidates are sensitive to how older people are going to vote. And so they're having to kind of like toe the line between appealing to the masses and not losing kind of their supporters that kind of like probably put in most of the money. So I think that Harris is pro cannabis. I think she'll be the safer bet if people are looking at like who to vote for from a cannabis perspective. But former President Trump couldn't have been any more specific about kind of tying lines with the industry, talking about how medical should be legal. It should be up to the states. He's voting yes on 3 in his home state. Like he couldn't have given us a stronger endorsement. So it took her longer to do it. Yeah.
No, I agree with you on that. I mean, I was surprised because I thought, part of the reason why he would get in is because either Uday or Kusei, one of his two sons, would decide that they want to be a part of this industry. So therefore, he wants to push that forward in the state that his family's in right now. But I also, I would say I did a hit on CNN a couple weeks ago with one of Harris's former campaign managers, and I brought it up. I literally backstage before we went out and shut down on the panel. And I was like, I'm gonna tell you something. Whoever goes in right now, this is like 3 weeks ago, and embraces this even more so than what Trump did. If you come out, step up and talk about, the fact that when you were saying you're worried about older constituents, well, you take a look at places like the villages in Florida, which is retirement village, and they got more cannabis being smoked down there than probably majority of the cities around America, because finally older adults in America are starting to recognize the same thing that's been recognized in Israel for the last 20 years. And that is that cannabis really is kind of, not an end to all, but it's a very positive, has very positive impact for a geriatric generation. And, the older constituency out there, I think is, they're being less vocal, but they're the ones that are sneaking out back at Thanksgiving, hitting their grandkids' vape pen and not letting their kids know that they did the grandkids' great vape pen. It's so funny. And I think that's really kind of spread across this nation. I have products in the marketplace in the Massachusetts area. I'm getting ready to have them in Georgia, and I was doing a lot of dispensary visits and pop ups, and shocked at how many people in my generation, I'm a little older than you, were popping in the store. I mean, it's very funny. You see the 55, 58-year-old and older, they walk out the store with 150, 200 to $300 worth of product. You see the, 18 to 24, 18 to 34 walk in, they walk out with $5, $10 worth of product. They'll buy 2 pre-rolls and walk out the door. Whereas the older generation will walk in and walk out the door with a couple $100 worth of product. And I find that says something that this industry needs to pay a little bit closer attention to. But also, I think our politicians definitely need to pay more attention to. I mean, I think that what's going on is that right now, though both candidates are trying to appeal to older generation to make sure they get out and vote, this would be something that they'd be surprised that the older generation is behind as much as they might not think we are.
Yeah, and it's further than that, right? I go back to like in 2015, 16, like I was having to raise money, right? I couldn't even get people that knew me, that know me forever, to even let me lease property from them, right? Like they were so scared of this thing. And then now those same people are showing me like, how cool is my vape pen, right? Like in 7, 8 years, we've gone from like scared to admit we smoke cannabis to like, hey, here's my cool vape pen, right? And so that transition has taken place. And now those people have completely transitioned. People 50 and older are using mushrooms, psychedelics. Like we're past the cannabis stage. Like we're now in the experimental phase of drugs where people are like, okay, not all these things are bad. I want to test some other things out and
I
see
agree
how it
with you
goes.
100%, but I'm also, what also shocks me though is that same set of people, yeah, you'll have a conversation among those that they know them and know that they are doing it, but they won't bring it up somewhere else. I mean, it's kind of funny. It's almost like, I don't know. I was at an event recently, and I was taken aback at how those around me, especially closer to my age, were like trying to whispering to sneak off. I'm like, what are you whispering for? I mean, who gives a shit what they think? I'll pull my pen right out of my pocket. What am I saying? And so it's like almost like, we have been so silent because most states don't allow for any form of promotion and advertisement, that we've taken that we can't talk about it at all. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on the fact that, I personally think it's part of this is because we have not been doing as much as an industry to take advantage of whatever loophole we can find to do more education, more education, more education, more education, be more present, more aware. I mean, in the last couple of months, I haven't seen that many articles about cannabis other than when Trump made his statement, but I haven't seen a lot. So what do you think we need to do to get the constituents to force the candidates to talk about this more?
That's a good question. We're still legislators that are so out of touch. You got some people in their 90s in office, and they come from a place that just, grew, no pun intended, but it grew from a place where drugs were bad, and it still hasn't left them. So they advocate for it. I think the industry has a hard time doing what it needs to do because it's really starved for capital. it's not as profitable as it should be battling a black market. And it's difficult when you are basically paying tax on your gross sales. And so it's hard to combat the lobbying that takes place from all the businesses that have been here and established for 100 years now. Like, you can't battle the tobacco, alcohol, and pharmaceutical lobby. And cannabis is a disruptor, right? Like, people are picking cannabis over alcohol every day, right? It takes over sleep aid, glaucoma,
And
pain,
I remember I remember
PTSD.
seeing some numbers talking about in 2021. Cannabis outsold milk. We know that this year cannabis has outsold alcohol. $25 billion in the legal market alone in 2021. I think when you're talking about that much product being sold, and then of course we know what's going on in the gray and black market. I mean, it just seems to me that the cat's out the bag. There's nothing any of these old politicians can do to put it back in. And at the same time, they talk out of both sides of the mouth. You've got Kentucky, who's trying to corner the market when it comes to hemp, but they don't really want to expand it. It's crazy, right?
Yeah, hemp, that one kind of came out. I think everybody suspected Mitch McConnell was going to be a disruptor at the Senate level over hemp, but I didn't think we were going to see this combative nature between hemp and regulated THC at every state level now. And so that's a whole nother facet that's kind of reared its head. And so ultimately, I think it all needs to just be regulated. I've met with U.S. senators that are starting to come around, but their answer to me, and this is more on the Republican side, and some of the older people that I think are kind of out of touch, like, I would get behind a completely regulated industry. And I say, well, that's a little complicated. And like, what do you mean? And I'm like, because as soon as we bring a bill to regulate THC and cannabis, the left turns it into a social justice issue, and then you start losing folks on the right. So that's what kind of gives me pause. Are we ever going to get through the Senate between kind of tangling what I would say is more like for people's needs rather than like the people's needs, which is us? And so at this point, these politicians don't do what's best for people. And until they do that, what are we left with? We're left with a states' rights issue.
Absolutely. And then when it comes to a states' rights issue, I mean, I would think that the majority of people in this country, when you hear those words, states' rights issues, they believe that, yes, if they leave this to the states like you leave other big issues, this could basically kind of pull itself out of this mire that it seems to be just stuck in. But they won't turn it over to the states really completely. And then, this whole idea, what happens if, in the conversation that I was having with the former campaign manager, they were saying that, well, because this issue is now before the DEA, this is part of the reason why I believe that, the vice president's not going to be able to step in and talk about this. And I'm like, why not? I mean, go ahead and let the DEA make the decision. And now, why do we have to wait till after the election? The DEA should have done this. It had 60 days to get it done. That would have happened before the election had they not given them more time to postpone it. And even, I've never been a proponent of this rescheduling. I've always been a proponent of descheduling. But if that's all we can get, why can't we get it?
I think we're getting rescheduling. I mean, the one thing I'll say that the Biden Harris campaign has followed through on is the rescheduling process that started 2.5 years ago. I mean, that's followed what I think is the fastest lineage of rescheduling a drug we've ever seen. And so now we're down to a hearing date on December 2nd, and then we'll see what the procedures look like past that. And I think that a judge hears that. And at this point, I mean, unless we get a president that appoints new people in office that become obstructionists, I just can't see rescheduling not getting done. Descheduling, I'm not as privy to how that needs to happen now. But at this point, rescheduling, I think, would give the industry like one extra push it needs to kind of continue modernizing itself.
But are you worried about? I had a lawyer on who has done most of the extensive heavy lifting for a lot of companies around the country, and we discussed the fact that I mean, if in fact they reschedule this, then where does that put that? That puts this as Schedule 3, puts it under the purview of the FDA, under the purview of an organization who was claimed and lied and said that it never had any medical efficaciousness, then turn around and now says, yes, we believe in the medical efficaciousness, but the people that are still at the FDA are the same people who poo-poo cannabis. So therefore, we put it under their purview. My God, I mean, if they chose to, and this is fact, since the 2002 patent that the U.S. government gave itself on CBD and all the other minor cannabinoids, that patent has been extended twice. Technically, if the Fed wanted to, they could come in and say, now that it's Schedule 3, oh, by the way, we own a patent on anything that says the word CBD, and therefore anybody who's got any product like that in any dispensary across the country, get it off your shelves because you are interfering on, and I see what I'm saying? This could be just open up a
Yeah.
Pandora's box that we're now in.
I understand that thesis. I don't think the FDA is going to come in here and overregulate and kind of like cause tremors.
You know,
I don't have any confidence in the FDA at all. It's a whole nother conversation about how our food is poison, and people have brought that up. And I think people are becoming smarter to that ultra processed foods is really what's killing our country. But I'm not as concerned with that. I actually think rescheduling probably opens up credit cards, eventually opens up banking. And so I ultimately think incremental reform is what we're going to get in this industry, and we have to take it and keep doing what we're doing with it, and eventually it'll tip over. I don't know how long it's going to be, but I think rescheduling is kind of the next stepping stone into that process.
See, I mean, I like that idea also, but then you got states like Georgia who put in their bill authorizing independent pharmacists to distribute cannabis. That's one of the only states that that has happened in.
Yep.
So that means that, and the DEA for jumped in there and issued a letter down there saying that, any independent pharmacy that gets involved in this, we're going to come in and shut you down. Now they
I saw
kind
that.
of repealed that letter. They didn't really repeal it, but they haven't acted on it. So now you've got this kind of a quagmire. You got some states that pharmacies can do it in, other states that pharmacies can't do it in. If they reschedule it, that means that all pharmacies should be able to do it. And that would then contradict their state law. And if state law is supposed to control it, see what I'm saying? Are we opening up a Pandora's box?
What I would say is that I always follow the money in the end, and that's usually where you find your answer. And right now, there's so many states that now depend on their cannabis tax,
Oh, yeah.
right? Several states are generating over $500 million in annualized tax. I don't think you can put that back in the box now. So the longer this goes on, where these states are dependent on their tax revenue for one place or the other, I actually think that's the one that sticks the longest, where the states are literally going to have to fight to keep what's going on. I don't know about whether if one state says pharmacies can allow it, whether that opens Pandora's box. I think that's just another state that made its own choice to allow states to govern that. If the federal government comes out and says, look, we're okay with any pharmacy selling cannabis, then I think it's open again. But it's another vehicle for Georgia to kind of, get things out to patients. And if that's the easiest way to get it to them, great.
Well, I think in the state of Georgia, because they didn't issue enough licenses for dispensaries, the current number of licenses for dispensaries, I think, makes people have to travel, in some cases, 50, 60 miles one way and one way back to go and find a dispensary somewhere near them. So that's the reason why they were saying, okay, in some of these rural areas, let's allow these independent pharmacists to do it. So therefore, once it's there, and and I'm working with a group there, it's called Botanical Sciences, that has signed on like 150 independent pharmacy plus that are waiting with bated breath to start carrying a product, but they're also, a little trepidation there because they're wondering whether or not the Fed's going to step in.
Yeah. I actually think that's honestly sensible, that they didn't want to license too many people and they knew they weren't going to get to rural communities, and so they could distribute through the pharmacies. It's a pretty sensible
I would
thought
agree.
process in my mind. I mean, it's fair.
Yeah, and
They're already distributing drugs anyways.
Yep, and especially since in most of the states that had any form of medical cannabis, reform or law in their states, they considered them an essential, one of the essential industries during the pandemic and kept them open. So I just don't see how you could shut that door. But if I was a state like, your company's in Maryland, right?
That's one. We're in several places. We're in Jersey, Arizona, Ohio. I reside in Texas, which is a big quagmire where basically every single gas station sells THCA and hemp and everything else. And we have an even more restricted cannabis program than Georgia.
that which is insane. I just came back from Texas and was surprised and shocked at how many people just were casually talking about the fact that they can get cannabis anywhere they want to get it. So yes, I mean, put your crystal ball on. What do you think of the next year looks like?
I think we're, I think, well, man, do you get to tell me who wins?
Well, I wish I could. I got to tell you, my friend, I am, different than most out here. I have literally, first, I'm an independent. I'll say that I'm an independent and will vote that way. But you flip a coin because I don't think you can determine a true winner right now, right this second. Even today, I don't think you could actually say, well, so and so is going to win or so and so is going to win. I think people are going to go inside that booth, close that curtain, and do what their heart. I don't know if it's their heart, but they're going to do something that they just were going to do and walk out of there and say they did the opposite. I just don't believe in any polls, and I don't believe conversations I have with people who actually try to tell me, well, I think I'm going to vote for this person. Well, but I really, I don't know. I can't crystal ball that myself.
I think that Florida has a pretty good chance of passing, which I think is huge for the industry because it's such a
Yeah.
big market.
Yes, I agree with
So
that.
I'm optimistic on that, and I do think like Trump's endorsement on cannabis was probably most impactful for that specific legislation over anything else. I think rescheduling gets implemented sometime in the second half of next year. I don't know how the litigation will impact it and whether judges really going to take that serious. I think the health secretary did a pretty good job of depicting how this is medicine. There's real science behind it. It's going to be very hard to combat it. And even from just common sense, it just doesn't belong as a Schedule One drug, regardless of where it belongs. It certainly doesn't belong in Schedule One. So I think the industry will find itself in a more comfortable place, but it's going to keep fighting. I don't think we're anywhere near where we need to get. And I just don't think it's going to happen as fast. And I think we have a slog. But I think we've got some pretty nice wins coming in the short term. But I think ultimately, like we've got, another decade to get to where we need to go.
Let's say again, we do see the schedule change by the end of next year, second half of next year. After the election, second half of next year, we see a schedule change. Do you see? See, I don't know why I have this. I'm not the naysayer. I'm not the sky's going to fall guy. But I swear to you, I don't trust the pharmaceutical industry as far as I can throw them. And they have been trying their damnedest to figure out how they can turn something that is nature driven into something that is, you know, been taken apart, reformulated, put back together again, that they can charge 500 times the amount for. I don't know if you remember, I know you remember the drug Marinol, right? That was out in the 80s and 90s. Go try to order it. Get your doctor to give you a prescription for that and go see if you can get it filled. Do you know, I think they won't give you less than like 100 of them. And the last time I had a prescription filled, it was almost $900. Okay, maybe, and I only filled them so that, to tell you the truth, I was traveling overseas and I wanted to have a container of a pharmaceutical bottle that had cannabis in it that I could literally, is it a little red BB or is it, I could put some other things in there and make sure that if somebody saw it, I had a prescription medication that I thought I would be safe with. But I took one of those once, and it was like the worst experience I ever had in my life. But Big Pharma can't help itself. This is all they know is how to figure out how can I turn one molecule into something where we know that the one molecule isn't working by itself. But do you fear Big Pharma trying to jump in and get in the way?
Man, that's a good question. Um, I agree with you 100% on where you're coming from. Just human growth hormone itself is so expensive, but taken in minute amounts basically helps people stay off other pharmaceuticals, right? Like the health benefits of things to keeping our hormones regulated and everything else. Like there's not much more valuable to a pharmaceutical company or insurance carriers basically long term than sick people that live a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So like when people are incentivized to keep people sick and keep them living a lot longer, in a capitalistic society, this is where you get a real push pull and a real struggle with like what's actually best for people and where do we end up. I don't know if the pharmaceutical industry is ready to give up or not. If they think the cat's so far out of the bag that they're going to have to figure out how to deal with this, because people have access to cannabis no matter what, whether you legalize it or not. The one thing that is happening, I feel like, across America and the vast majority of the populace, they're not enforcing the illegality of it anymore either, right? Like it's cliche to put somebody in jail for having weed on them now. I think that's happening very, very seldomly. So like the mass distribution of this is kind of going on, across the whole country. Like, do they tap out? They dig their hands in it? Do they own the industry? I'm just not certain.
Well, that being said, what do you think about the fact if we go ahead and deschedule, big alcohol, big tobacco got a lot more cash than big cannabis. So, are you afraid that they're going to try to step in here and steal away part of this also?
Well, I think eventually in our society, big business owns it all, right? So you got to take a step further. Who owns them, right? I mean, like
Right.
3 or 4 private equity companies own 80+% of the S&P. So ultimately, I think alcohol, tobacco, and special interests is going to own cannabis. Like, I don't think there's any way around it. They'll own the brands in the end, and they'll own the distribution.
Wow. And what do you think that's going to do to the industry? Because from my perspective, it's crazy the fact that here are people who have fought against something now actually get in a position that they can take it over. And I think the benefit of the consumer, it goes right out the window. I don't trust, any alcohol company that's poo-pooed cannabis for the last 20 years to now all of a sudden say, well, we got a product that I think you ought to support. Why would I bother buying something from some people who've claimed that, they never believed in it working?
Yeah. I think the craft side of the business will exist in cannabis for a very long time. I don't know. And there's a chance the retail holds. I mean, there's still states where you can only go out to a state liquor store and buy alcohol, right? So some of those laws have stuck for a long time. I don't know how long it's going to be before you can go buy something at Circle K or, QT, a Quick Trip or whatever, Albertsons. The longer that holds out and the more of the states are bifurcated, the small guy can keep winning. But as soon as they see like $100 billion industry in 2050, and the way lobbying works in our country, I just don't see how they don't swallow the whole industry at some point.
Right, right. And when you say, do you think they'll swallow by coming in and investing in current businesses like yours? Or will they come in and try to just buy you out, take you over and say, see you later, buddy. I'll take this from here at this point on.
Man, I think eventually I think these companies, the way they're constructed now, so these MSOs are having to grow, distribute, retail, make products, manufacture. Like we have to do like 5 or 6 or 7 things good, right? I think these are going to get pieced off. Like I think the cultivators are going to get pieced off. And then the brands are going to get pieced off and the retail is going to get pieced off and it'll turn into like traditional business. So some will survive on the retail side, some will survive on some craft manufacturing, but eventually like there's going to be a Bud Light, there's going to be a Miller Lite, there's going to be that like massive bottom shelf where people go in and buy, 80% of their product. The flower is still surprisingly the highest category by far, 45% in my dispensaries. Like that customer sticky. And so, but is it going to be easier for people to go buy gummies and vapes over time? I think the category grows stronger. But I think these companies are going to get pieced up and broken up and then bought and sold, and some will stay and some mom and pops will survive. But eventually, like the major brands, the mass production of the ones that are sold the most will be owned by CPG companies.
Well, now I've been a person who said this since day one. I think the consumer, honestly, if we allow the consumer to be the voice of us, they're the ones who literally, the more and more we can educate them, I think the more and more this industry will thrive. I mean, it's like right this minute. Yeah, we're starting to see, again, like I said earlier, that grandparent is going outside on Thanksgiving evening out on the back deck with their grandson hitting that vape pen. and then coming back inside and finishing that turkey dinner, you know. But there are a lot of grandparents out there who still are reticent because they are still believing the old bullcrap. I mean, how much do you think our industry should be paying attention to driving as much information to the consumer as they possibly can to get them to make sure that, number one, we stay relevant, and number two, that there's products out there that, they're saying we want this, and so the more and more they say we want this, politicians are going to have to listen.
It's actually the most important thing. It's happening. When I was at Harvest, the team had a 503c nonprofit. They had a pediatric epilepsy foundation, and there was nothing more powerful than a mom who was completely against cannabis turning around and telling people, hey, I'm not worried about my son being dead in the morning because of cannabis now. And so that continual education from, hey, I just want to get stoned and I feel better at night, it takes some anxiety off from work, all the way to, hey, I'm not worried about my son being dead in the morning, and everything in between that is what carries this all the way through. And I think that's happening at an exponential rate now. Like, this isn't the devil's lettuce anymore, right? Like, we're trying to
Right.
get away from that persona, and it's happening relatively quickly.
But I'll tell you a very funny one. I watched I and my wife, we binge on streaming shows all the time, and I've been complaining about this for about the last year straight. I mean, you turn on a streaming program, and the hero or heroine, they come in after a hard day's work, and they all go to the kitchen. They pour themselves four fingers of some brown liquor, and they stand there at the counter and they're drinking. This is a star of the show. They're pounding this back. Then just recently, I watched a streamer um, called The Perfect Couple. I don't know if you've seen this yet. It's got Nicole Kidman and Liam Shriver in it. And he literally, and the thing about it I thought was so cool is the fact that it was a 6-7 episode series, but the star literally every time he walked in the house, came in from something, he fired up a pre-roll. And he fired up the pre-roll and no one reacted to it. It was just like natural occurrence. I think the more and more we start to see that, the more and more that will become acceptable. Though Hollywood has not done us a favor because most of the shows that they only want to do are, let's get high eating, let's get high doing this, let's get high. They keep beating over the top, the message of, the stoner attitude rather than it's just a way of life. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. There's been like 2 interviews I've seen in the last few years, I think, that like drew really strong attention to the fact that people just don't care. There was one interview where Elon Musk was totally stoned and he got on,
Yep.
he was super emotional. That thing got crazy amount of hits, and people are like, man, he's stoned. And he's like, yeah, I don't care. Like, I'm stoned, right? Like, he didn't
Mm-hmm.
care. And then I don't know if you saw this one over the weekend, but Portnoy got on and he was like advocating Yes on 3 in Florida, and he was so stoned, and it was like crazy, went viral, right? And he had like
I didn't see
smoke
it.
puffing up everywhere. Yeah, you can find it on Twitter, but you can see it. He's like puffing up a storm, and people went nuts. And so, like, that's pretty profound because we come out of these movies in the 90s where we're like, I can't remember the one with Seth Rogen where he was like super stoned. Oh, it was Pineapple Express, right?
Right.
Like, everything's
Right.
been like this joke about people getting stoned and sitting on a couch and eating pizza and being lazy, to like, no, this is like mainstream drug that has a lot of different kinds of benefits and directions. And yes, you can get stoned and go eat pizza, right? Just so you get drunk and you show up at some diner at 3 a.m. and eat, right? But
Right.
it is becoming more socially acceptable. I think that's where you're going with this. And,
Right.
like, people aren't as embarrassed to pull out a vape pen and get stoned anymore at a party. Like, people just do it. Whereas,
But
yeah,
homeboy, I ain't embarrassed. If I'm in a state and it's legal, and I know that the state has some form of legal cannabis in it, either medical or not, I'll pull my vape pen out in a heartbeat, and I don't care who sees it.
I haven't heard of anybody to like traveling in and out of states that do or don't allow it, like where the airport security, or I don't even think gummies or whatever. I haven't heard of anybody getting busted for that in a long time.
Because we are on this forum, I don't want to say, but let's just tell you that I haven't seen it. Period. I mean, come on, man. I got a business in Massachusetts, and I'm not. I'm not flaunting anything, but I'm just trying to say, nobody cares. And 9 times out of 10, I mean, it's very funny. Recently, I literally was in I try not to break the law. I'm not going to vape in a restaurant where there's no smoking. But, if I get up from my table and I walk out that door and the people in the restaurant inside are looking at the door and I happen to be on the outside of that restaurant, mind your own business because I'm doing what I feel like doing and I'll come back in and finish my meal. And I'll come back in. It was so funny. I'm sorry, I'm crying. I happen to be, I don't want to say this because I make sure that I don't have, some nefarious group looking in on my podcast, but I was in a state where it is still not legal. And I was in a restaurant and and now I'm going to tell you something. I have MS. And what cannabis does for me may be different than what it does for others. But what it does for me, unfortunately, one of my main symptoms is extreme neuropathic pain in my feet and my shins, my legs. So sometimes if it becomes unbearable, I got to duck in the bathroom. I got to go outside. And I happen to be in a state recently where it's not legal. And I couldn't see the bathroom. I didn't know what the bathroom was. I just got up. I went to the front door. I walked outside, not realizing that, I was really, honestly, I did. It's just stupid on my part because the sunlight was coming through my hotel. So how come you're so stupid to not realize that the windows you could see out of? But I went outside the restaurant, pulled out my vape pen, stood there for a second. And I was like, calm my legs down. As soon as I did, put my pen back in my pocket, went back in, sat down, and literally 2 tables over from me, 3 tables worth of people applauded me.
Wow.
They shook their head like that, and I was like, heartfelt because they recognized what it was I did, and I knew they recognized what it was I did, but I got an applause out of that. I was kind of crazy.
Yeah, that's a transition. I haven't heard that one before.
Yeah, really wild. And again, these are people who recognize it was me. So they also recognize that I'm very open and vocal about what I'm doing, and especially when it comes to cannabis. But the fact that they literally gave me this really cool little light applause, and one person was like this, yeah, go ahead, man, take care of yourself. And I was like, thank you. You know what I mean? So I think publicly, and my friend, I'm telling you, I wish I could work with a company like yours or others who are willing to take the time to, what we can do in almost every state is we can do educational public service announcements. We can't promote our products. We can't promote a brand, but what we can do is promote the fact that the historical information that you've heard about this product isn't necessarily true. And let me educate you on what it does. But we don't go after that and pushing the limit. I will tell you, right now is the time for us to start pushing the limit, starting getting. I mean, there's no reason why we are doing, more documentaries like, Sanjay Gupta's done 3. But I mean, he shouldn't be the only person that's out there doing it. We should all be doing it more and more and more and more and more. We can educate the masses and make them understand that this is a viable, efficacious product for those who suffer, along with those who want to have their adult decision. But for those who are suffering and those who are in need, man, this is a viable medication for all of us.
You're right. Recently I live in Texas, and so
Okay.
I've got I play golf's kind of my hobby, so I'm around a lot of older conservatives. And there's a gentleman that I've recently become friends with. He's got a very Christian background. And he's had C3, C4 pain in his neck. He hasn't slept over 3 hours in a night in, 10 years. He's had multiple neck surgeries. And I gave this guy some CBN THC gummies and said, hey, and cannabis is never even something he thought of doing. He's been taking Ambien, all this other stuff, right? A guy came and gave me a hug. He was blowing up in tears, like crying. And I'm like, I have dozens of these stories where I've helped people with the most simple little thing that changed their life. because we deal in a very naive society when it comes to this one particular drug that's grown in a plant outside of water and sunlight. And it
My friend,
keeps me going.
well, my friend, I'm telling you, I have those same number of stories. And to me, that's what, on a Saturday evening or a Sunday morning or a Friday night, just as did you know, kind of a public service announcement. I'm telling you, man, we put more and more of this out there. We will change those 90-year-old politicians because they're not going to have a choice. When their constituents start to say, I saw that on Friday night. The same way that pharma shoves, another pill up your ass every 15 seconds while you're watching television every day. If we were starting to at least run on a regular basis just some informational kinds of public service announcements about cannabis, I think we could change the attitudes.
You're
I
right.
really do.
I agree wholeheartedly.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, and how about just before we go, what are your thoughts about what's going on internationally, my friend? I mean, I've been involved with companies that are working out of South Africa, out of South America, companies that are working and involved in the Isle of Man and out in Europe. I mean, the rest of the world is starting to embrace the fact that, you know what, rather than paying $300, $400, $500 for these pills that big pharma's shoving down our throats, this is something that's easier and more palatable to their constituents. We may end up, what do you call it? I mean, literally sucking hind tit to, some international companies. Well, I bet they won't allow them to import into the United States, but there's going to be a hard road for us to hoe trying to get our products exported when there's going to be so many other countries out there right now. Australia is coming on right now. I did a podcast with some people from Australia who, literally, I'm telling you, my friend, boy, if you wanted a little hand, I would jump down to Australia right now and show them the way because they don't understand even a tenth of what we know in the United States. But internationally, the international markets are starting to take off. What do you think about that?
I'm surprised that we transitioned ahead of Europe just based on their personality in general. It's an interesting place. They're perceived as more liberal, but generally kind of more conservative in ways. I think Germany, obviously, going legal and kind of pushing the agenda there is the streamline to them. There's a massive amount of people there. It's a huge market. It's bigger than California. So
Absolutely. I'll tell you a very funny story. In Germany, 6 months before they actually passed their law, it's the first time, it's just crazy. I was literally going to Dubrovnik. I was flying from the United States to Dubrovnik. I had to stop in Germany to change planes to go on. And I'm telling you, this was crazy because I travel all the time. I had dug through my bags, making sure I had nothing in there, thinking that. Um, and I had left a container this big, that small of a container, tiny little thing, less than a gram. It's probably like 3/4 of a gram of keef that was tucked away in the bottom of one of my bags in my carry-on bag. And I really honestly didn't even know it was there. So in Germany, leaving, coming into the EU, going from the EU to someplace in the EU, catching another plane, I had to go through another internal security thing. And this Broomhilda chick who was like one of their TSA agents, saw this little thing, pulled it out, opened it up. Whoo, you have to stand here. And it pulled me aside. And I was like, oh my God, I forgot I even had that. And, I'm thinking to myself now, this whole encounter is caught by somebody on a phone. So by the time I'm even 4 minutes in, it's already on TMZ. Montel Williams busted in Germany for cannabis. This is the funniest thing that ever happened. So I'm standing off the side, and walking up to me is this, 6'1", blonde, international Interpol agent, along with two guys that are with her that are under 6 foot, who are clearly undercover people walking around in the airport. And I'm thinking, oh Lord, here I go. I'm getting ready to do the purple walk. And she walks up to me and she says, your name, Mr. Williams? I said, yes. She goes, um, I see what you have something in your bag. Is this cannabis? And I said, ma'am, it is, and I'm so sorry. I didn't realize I'd flown in here. Now, any place else, if I'd been rushed, they'd lock my ass up. I'd be dragged down the back of the hallways and move around. She said, we here in Germany are about to pass a law allowing for this medically and also legally, though it's not passed now. Um, I'm just going to tell you here, you take this back. I don't know where you're going, but you can't do that in this airport. I understand. I see who you are. She's holding up an article, and this article is talking about, some advocacy I had done in California. And she said, but please do not use this in this airport. But you're free to go. And she gave it back to me. I went back, got on my flight. I took off. I was like, are you kidding me? You know, how lucky am I? The fact that even before she even walked up, she looked up and Googled my name and Googled who I was. I guess it's the security people had given her my name off my ticket. And I Googled it. And I was cracking up. And then 6 months later, they went ahead and passed the law. And now Germany, where our original volcanoes came out of, they actually are dispensing and utilizing cannabis in hospitals over there.
Yeah. It's a step. They're just 10 years behind us. Europe. It's going to tip over everywhere. They're going to cut their own deals. They're not enforcing over there either. I was just in Scotland playing golf, and the conversation comes up with a caddy. What do you do? And I'm like, well, I'm a drug dealer, and then they kind of laugh, And they're like showing me their weed as they're pulling it out of their pocket, because like all these caddies are stoners. Like it is just part of their culture. They just love cannabis. And he's like, look at this shit I've got to smoke, man. Get this law changed over here, And I'm like, is anybody getting in trouble over here for this? And they're like, no. Like it just doesn't happen, but just not legally.
Right. Absolutely. Well, I'm telling you, sir, I could talk to you for the next 3 or 4 hours, but we're running out of time. So I got to thank you so much for being a part of our show today. And we'd love to have you back anytime you ever want to come back. I'd love to have you back. And if you got anything you want to talk about, anything happening in history, and maybe after the election, we can chop it up again to see where we think it's going to go. Huh?
Sounds good. Thanks, guys.
Absolutely, Jason. Thank you so much. A enlightening conversation. And if people wanted to get more information about what you're doing, give me your stats. Tell me where you are. .com, .what? Where are you at?
You can find me on Instagram, my name. You can find me on Twitter. I respond to all patients, customers, whoever. So if people DM me online, they can look up Story Cannabis. They'll find me. I'm the only Jason Vedadi, so it's a blessing and not so much a blessing. But if anybody wants to get in touch with me, they're going to get my response. I respond to everybody.
And I want them to make sure that they check out your op-ed piece that's in MG Magazine, because I tell you, very, very enlightening. I'm going to probably do a whole podcast on that myself, just so I could share some of the stats and numbers that you put in there, which were great. So I got to thank you so much for being a part of the show today. I'm going to thank all of our viewers for tuning in and listening. And make sure you tune into the next episode of Let's Be Blunt with Montel.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining me on Let's Be Blunt with Montel. Please make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell to be notified when new episodes post each week. We'd love to hear your feedback also, so please send us your comments.